Welcome, friends. Tonight, we join Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin as they navigate a labyrinth of long-buried secrets, fractured loyalties, and a legacy poisoned by hidden bloodlines. In a mystery where pride proves more fatal than any weapon, Wolfe's unerring logic and Archie's sharp wit are the only lights cutting through the shadows. Where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it for you? Settle in. This is a story where even the deepest roots of a family tree can strangle those meant to inherit its legacy. It was one of those rare New York afternoons when the brownstone was breathing peace instead of orchids. Wolfe had barricaded himself upstairs in the plant rooms. Fritz was muttering to himself in the kitchen about a soufflé, and I had the office to myself, my feet comfortably perched on Wolfe's desk, contemplating whether I'd risk a third cup of Fritz's scalding coffee. That fragile harmony collapsed the moment the doorbell buzzed, with the persistence of a woman who either had no manners or had urgent business. I heaved myself upright, tossed the coffee cup into the wastebasket, and opened the door. The woman standing there was dressed like Fifth Avenue money, but wore an expression borrowed from a funeral parlor. Mid-50s, meticulously polished, but with a certain brittle edge that told me she hadn't smiled in a long time. "Mrs. Daphne Harrow?" she announced crisply, offering a card before I could ask. "I must speak with Mr. Wolfe. It is urgent." I gave the card a glance, nodded as if I were the King's Chamberlain, and ushered her into the office, waving her toward the red leather chair that had crushed the spirits of many a client before her. "Sit tight," I said. "I'll fetch His Excellency." As I mounted the stairs, her perfume trailed behind me like a ghost, hinting that the air of the brownstone was about to get a lot heavier than orchids. Wolfe received the news of a visitor with his usual enthusiasm, meaning he scowled at me as though I had personally orchestrated her arrival. Nevertheless, he descended to the office, adjusting the knot of his yellow silk cravat with a ceremonial slowness designed to intimidate. Mrs. Harrow rose when he entered, but Wolfe barely nodded before settling into the massive chair behind his desk, the chair that gave him the distinct advantage of looking down his nose at nearly everyone. "You may proceed, madam," he said, steepling his fingers. Her voice, when she spoke, was composed but cracked at the edges. "It concerns the will of my late brother, Charles Harrow. It was opened last week and—" She hesitated, visibly bracing herself. "It names a fourth child as a beneficiary." Wolfe's brows lifted a quarter inch. In his world, that was tantamount to falling out of his chair. "Your brother had 3 children, if memory serves," Wolfe said. "Correct. Grant, Claudia, and Victor. There was never a whisper, a hint of another." I watched Wolfe's gaze sharpen. He might not have cared about the affairs of the living, but the affairs of the dead often stirred his interest, provided they carried the scent of contradiction. "Madam, wills are curious documents. They can reveal inconvenient truths or perpetrate elaborate frauds. Which do you suspect?" She flinched slightly, betraying an inner tension. "That is precisely the problem. I do not know." "And you wish me," Wolfe said, his tone verging on derision, "to resolve this absurdity?" She leaned forward, desperation bleeding into her poise. "Before it destroys what remains of our family." At that, Wolfe's eyelids flickered, and I knew he was considering her appeal. But it would take more than sentiment to move Nero Wolfe. Mrs. Harrow composed herself, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her skirt, before plunging into deeper waters. "My brother was a cautious, deliberate man. He would never include a 4th child in his will on a whim or by mistake. Either someone deceived him, or—" She paused, throat tightening. "Or there is a truth we never knew." "Scandal?" Wolfe prompted, his voice mild, the words sliding across the room like a dagger. She did not deny it. "There have been rumors, whispers, long ago, of an indiscretion. My brother was a widower for many years. It's conceivable—" She halted, searching for a less damaging word, found none. "Conceivable he fathered a child outside the family." I kept my face neutral, but inside I was calculating. The math added up to motive, resentment, and maybe worse, Alternatively, Wolfe said, the will could have been tampered with. Forgery is an ancient and tiresome crime. Mrs. Harrow shook her head with vehemence. The legal firm verified the will's authenticity. No tampering, no ambiguity. She leaned forward, her voice a low, urgent plea. Mr. Wolfe, I am afraid someone intends to fabricate an heir, to defraud the estate, to rip open old wounds for personal gain. I could see Wolfe shifting from contemptuous disinterest to reluctant curiosity. Scandal, fraud, deceit. He considered such matters part of human horticulture, and he was, after all, a master cultivator. Wolfe sighed, the sound of a man shouldering an undesired burden. Madam, I have neither the inclination nor the time to mediate family disputes rooted in ancient peccadilloes. Mrs. Harrow, however, was prepared. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded sheet of heavy vellum, which she slid across the desk with a certain finality. It was a cashier's check. I didn't need Wolfe's keen eyesight to spot the number of zeros dancing at the end. Wolfe allowed himself a glance. His nostrils flared slightly, the only sign of life his face betrayed. Your urgency, he said, his voice suddenly less brittle, deserves consideration. I shall accept your retainer. Mr. Goodwin will make the necessary inquiries. I, of course, shall direct matters from this chair. She exhaled, relief flickering across her features. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. I cannot tell you what this means to me. No, you cannot, Wolfe agreed, and without further ceremony, gestured toward the door. Mrs. Harrow rose with the grace of old money well spent, leaving behind the lingering scent of lilacs and lies. I knew, as sure as I knew my own name, that we had just opened a door better left locked. The door had barely clicked shut behind Mrs. Harrow when Wolfe muttered, "Pfui," and lumbered back toward the elevator, already retreating to his sanctum. That left me, as usual, with the unglamorous chores. I picked up the phone to make the necessary preliminary calls, starting with Harrow's attorney. Polite small talk yielded an interesting nugget. The will, I learned, had been scheduled for formal reading next week. Abruptly, it had been moved up to tomorrow. No reason given, the lawyer said, his voice too smooth. Just a family request. I hung up and stared at the silent office. In Wolfe's world, sudden changes were never innocent. Someone was maneuvering, and maneuvering fast. I climbed the stairs to the plant rooms, ignoring the tropical heat that blasted me in the face. Wolfe was ensconced in his yellow chair, eyes closed, the picture of serenity. They moved up the will reading, I said. Tomorrow? He opened one eye. Predictable. Predictable? I demanded. Somebody's sweating and you're predicting it like a weatherman. Of course, fear, Mr. Goodwin, accelerates events. He closed his eye again. We shall attend. And just like that, the Harrow family's skeletons began to rattle, whether they liked it or not. The Harrow estate looked as though it had been built with resentment baked into the mortar. An imposing stone manor on the outskirts of Westchester, it was the sort of place designed to intimidate trespassers and family members alike. I parked the roadster along the gravel path, feeling the eyes of a stone lion at the front gate, following my every move. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew. The few gathered mourners offered the kind of polite nods that were more obligation than grief. Grant Harrow stood near the fireplace, looking as solid and humourless as an iron gate. Claudia Harrow lounged on a chaise with the languor of a woman who found mourning inconvenient to her schedule. Victor Harrow, gaunt and pale, kept to a corner, fiddling with a cufflink as if it held the secrets of the universe. If there had been genuine sorrow over Charles Harrow's death, it had already been packed away with the black suits and veils. What remained was calculation, sharp and hungry. I took a seat near the back, close enough to hear but far enough to stay out of the first volley of family hostilities. Given the looks being exchanged, I didn't expect to wait long. The family attorney, a wiry little man named Putnam, cleared his throat with the solemnity of a judge passing sentence. He adjusted his glasses, pulled a folded document from his briefcase, and began to read. The opening paragraphs were the usual fare, formal acknowledgements, instructions for funeral arrangements, polite nods to the charitable institutions Charles Harrow had apparently remembered at the last minute. The heirs listened with the fixed expressions of people awaiting a dinner menu at a mediocre restaurant. And then came the line that turned the room colder than the marble foyer. "To my 4 beloved children," Putnam intoned, "I leave my estate in equal portions, to be divided per stirpes, with no prejudice to birthright, name, or blood." There was a pause, a small, perfect silence, before Grant spoke, his voice slicing through it. "4?" he demanded. Putnam blinked once, owl-like. "4?" Claudia shifted uncomfortably, and Victor went rigid, the cufflink forgotten in his lap. No one asked the obvious question out loud, but it hung there, heavy as a black cloud. Who was the 4th? Putnam offered no clarification. The will contained no codicil, no explanatory letter. It simply stated the existence of a 4th heir, as though that fact had been carved in granite years before. From my seat, I watched the Harrow siblings recalculating the arithmetic of their inheritance, and perhaps their loyalties. The formal reading barely concluded before the room erupted into muted chaos. Grant rounded on Putnam, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck stood out like drawn wires. "This is absurd," he snapped. "My father had 3 children. 3, no more." Putnam spread his hands helplessly, as if to disavow responsibility for the dead man's last wishes. "The language of the will is clear." Victor rose slowly from his chair, his eyes darting between Grant and Claudia. "Unless," he said, voice brittle, "someone here knows something they haven't shared." The implication hung there, poisonous. Claudia stiffened. "Oh, don't start, Victor," she said, her voice syrupy with scorn. "You're always the one who saw shadows in every corner." Victor's lips twisted. "And you, dear sister, always made sure there were shadows to see." Grant cut across them both, voice rising. "This is not the time or place for your childish quarrels." "No," Victor said quietly. "This is the perfect time, because if there's a 4th heir, it affects us all. It affects the estate, the business, everything." I stayed silent, scribbling mental notes. Sibling rivalry was older than Cain and Abel, but this had the smell of something deeper, something old and half-rotted, dragged reluctantly into daylight. Claudia tossed her hair and crossed her arms. Maybe father had secrets. Maybe he was tired of playing favorites. Maybe he didn't trust any of us. Grant's face turned a darker shade, but he said nothing. Sometimes silence tells you more than words. Across the room, Victor rubbed the side of his nose with a shaking hand, a tell if I ever saw one. Secrets were crawling under the Harrow family's skin, and the scratching was about to get louder. After the attorney packed up his papers and the perfunctory condolences were exchanged, the room broke into pockets of low, heated conversation. No one offered me a drink, which was just as well. I preferred to keep a clear head when sharks were circling. I caught a few fragments of conversation as I wandered casually among the mourners. Could be a forgery? He would never have done it. Money always brings out the worst. Victor stood near a window, staring out into the sprawling lawn, as if expecting the 4th heir to appear like a ghost from the hedgerows. Claudia whispered furiously into her cell phone, her perfectly manicured nails tapping a restless tattoo on the back of a chair. Grant barked orders into his own phone, summoning legal reinforcements. And Putnam? He slipped away the moment protocol allowed, a weasel escaping a sinking ship. There were too many questions and not enough answers, but one thing was certain. This family was not going to weather the coming storm gracefully. Grief had been buried beneath suspicion. Whatever warmth had once existed among the Harrow siblings was now cold, brittle, and ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. As I made my way back to the roadster, I took one last look at the estate, silhouetted against the setting sun. The fourth child wasn't just an inconvenient legal question, it was a ticking bomb, and somebody inside that house already heard it ticking louder than the rest. The call came just as I was contemplating whether Fritz's leftover pie was worth a late-night stomachache. It was a sharp, brittle voice on the other end, Putnam, the Harrow family lawyer, barely keeping the tremor out of his words. "Mr. Goodwin, there's been an incident. Grant Harrow is dead." For half a second I thought I had misheard him. Grant Harrow had struck me as a man who would live forever out of sheer stubbornness. But Putnam wasn't the imaginative type. "Dead how?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "There's no clear explanation," Putnam stammered. It happened after dinner. You should come." He hung up before I could press him further. I grabbed my hat, muttered a few words Wolfe would have reprimanded me for, and was out the door. The road back to the Harrow estate seemed longer and colder than it had earlier that day. A man dying was bad enough. A man dying right after a will had been cracked open was worse. By the time I turned onto the gravel drive, the estate loomed ahead like a mausoleum that had been waiting for this moment all along. Somewhere inside, death had found its first foothold, and I had the unpleasant suspicion it wasn't done yet. The front door was ajar when I arrived, which told me everything I needed to know about the state of order inside. I pushed through and found a cluster of people gathered in the parlour, faces pale, voices low, the room vibrating with barely suppressed panic. Putnam met me near the door, wringing his hands like he wished he could disappear into the wallpaper. "Where is he?" I asked. He jerked his chin toward a side room. "The library. The police are on their way." Inside the library, Grant Harrow lay slumped in an armchair, looking as if he had merely dozed off, except for the unnatural tilt of his head and the glass of brandy still clutched loosely in his hand. Fritz's pie, safe back at the brownstone, seemed a distant dream. I leaned in, careful not to touch anything. There was a sharp, acrid smell in the air, faint but distinct, not something you picked up in a dusty library. I straightened and caught Putnam's nervous eye. "Poison?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "The doctor who was summoned believes so. Cyanide." "And no one saw anything?" I said. Putnam shook his head, his Adam's apple bobbing like it was trying to escape. I had seen enough to know this wasn't random or impulsive. Someone had slipped death into Grant Harrow's drink with a hand as sure as a surgeon's scalpel. The question was who and what exactly Grant had known that made him dangerous enough to kill. The rest of the Harrows were huddled in the drawing room, looking like actors waiting for the next act in a play they hadn't rehearsed. Claudia clutched a silk handkerchief she hadn't used, while Victor sat rigid, his eyes hollow. I started with Victor, who looked ready to crumble under the weight of his own nerves. "Did you see Grant pour his drink?" I asked. He shook his head. He poured it himself, from the decanter. "And the decanter?" I pressed. "Everyone had some," he said quickly. "It wasn't just his glass," which complicated things but not fatally. Cyanide didn't linger. It acted fast. If the whole decanter had been poisoned, we'd be dealing with a parlour full of corpses. I moved to Claudia next. She gave me a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I left before dessert," she said. "I didn't even stay for coffee." "Convenient," I said, letting my tone suggest I wasn't impressed. She lifted one shoulder in a shrug. My father loved drama. I had no patience for another Harrow family performance. Putnam backed up their stories with a general murmur of agreement, though I noticed he didn't meet my eyes when he said it. It was classic. Too many witnesses, none of them useful, and all of them secretly grateful. Grant was no longer breathing. One man dead, a family poised to fracture, and no one willing to admit they'd seen the knife being sharpened. Inspector Kramer arrived with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for dental surgery. He took one look at the dead body, another at the room full of tight-lipped relatives, and then fastened his glare onto me like I was personally responsible. "You again?" he growled. "Pure coincidence," I said. "I'm just here for the family reading hour." Kramer wasn't amused. He barked orders to his men, who began sealing the library and taking down names. I didn't envy them. The Harrows weren't going to be generous with details. "You can tell Wolfe," Kramer said, stabbing a finger at me, "to keep his big nose out of this." "I'll pass that along," I said, "after he finishes laughing." Kramer grunted and turned away, already burdened by the knowledge that if Nero Wolfe took an interest in this case, the NYPD would be playing catch-up in their own backyard. And Wolfe, I knew, was already interested. I returned to the brownstone with the smell of cyanide still clinging to my jacket, and found Wolfe exactly where I expected him, ensconced in his chair, glass of beer within easy reach. He listened without interruption as I delivered the facts. When I finished, he opened his eyes and regarded me as if I were an underperforming orchid. "Timely," he said finally. "You think it's connected?" I asked. Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Not merely connected, Mr. Goodwin. Inexorable." Mr. Harrow intended to speak. "His death is the silencing of an inconvenient voice." "And the fourth child?" He exhaled, long and slow. "Becomes not merely a curiosity, but the fulcrum." Which meant in Wolfe's universe that finding the fourth heir wasn't just a matter of inheritance anymore. It was a matter of life and death. And the meter on that clock was running faster by the hour. Wolfe disliked leaving his home more than he disliked cold beef, which meant dragging the surviving Harrows into our office was a foregone conclusion. Fritz arranged chairs with grim precision, and I had the feeling he'd have preferred to hose the clients off at the door. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a mountainous presence radiating authority, while Victor, Claudia, and Mrs. Daphne Harrow arranged themselves with the wariness of reluctant defendants. "I will be succinct," Wolfe began, his tone clipped. "Your brother's death is under active investigation. His reference to a fourth heir is not idle nonsense. It is germane. You will answer my questions fully, promptly, and without embroidery." Claudia crossed her legs elegantly, her mouth twitching with restrained amusement. Victor clasped his hands so tightly his knuckles whitened. Mrs. Harrow merely folded her gloves in her lap, her expression unreadable. Wolfe's gaze moved from one face to the next. "Who precisely among you," he asked, "believes the fourth child is real?" A shuffling of feet, averted eyes. The silence stretched thin enough to tear. Victor was the one to break it, his voice dry and oddly defiant, setting the next course before Wolfe could steer it himself. "It's possible," Victor said with a grim little smile, "that the fourth child is precisely what it sounds like, an inconvenient byproduct of father's less respectable pursuits." Claudia inhaled sharply, but Victor pressed on, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "You knew him, Mother. You knew what he was. You all pretend he was some sort of patriarchal paragon, but he wasn't. He was flesh and blood, and not particularly careful about where he sowed it." Mrs. Harrow stiffened. Wolfe merely lifted one heavy hand in a gesture of disdainful patience. "You suggest," Wolfe said, "that Charles Harrow fathered an illegitimate child?" Victor nodded. "It fits. It explains why he kept it buried, and why someone might kill to keep it buried longer." Claudia leaned forward, her voice dripping sarcasm. "That's rich, coming from the golden boy of academia. Weren't you the one who insisted father was infallible when it came to family honor?" Victor's smile was bleak. "I was wrong." I watched them, the way one watches a fire creeping up dry wood. There was something behind Victor's bitterness, not just resentment, but real fear. Wolfe noted it too. His eyes narrowed the way they did when a rare orchid revealed a flaw invisible to the casual observer. If Victor's scandal theory was accurate, it raised more questions than it answered, and sharpened the motive for murder considerably. Claudia sat back in her chair, crossing her arms with the grace of a woman used to winning arguments by refusing to have them. For a long moment, she let the silence settle, then smiled, a slow, sly smile that warned trouble. "You're all so sure father's sins were biological," she said lightly. "Maybe the real secret is older and dirtier." Wolfe's eyebrows inched upward, a movement that for him was equivalent to shouting. "Clarify," he said. Claudia tapped a manicured nail against the armrest. Let's just say, not everything that happened 20 years ago stayed buried. Betrayals have long shadows. Victor stiffened visibly. Mrs. Harrow shifted in her seat. I didn't need Wolfe's brain to know Claudia had hit a nerve. What betrayal? Wolfe asked, his voice clipped. Claudia laughed softly. Ask Mother. Mrs. Harrow shot her a warning glance, sharp enough to slice porcelain. Claudia rose from her seat with the careless grace of a dancer leaving a stage. You wanted truths, she said. I gave you a breadcrumb. You can follow it, or not. She walked to the door, heels clicking like punctuation marks on a sentence she wasn't willing to finish. Wolfe said nothing, but I could feel the office tilt slightly toward him, as though waiting for his next move. It wasn't just an illegitimate child lurking behind the Harrow estate's crumbling facade. There was a betrayal, old and poisonous, that none of them dared speak aloud. Mrs. Harrow remained seated, composed, but pale. Wolfe turned his gaze on her, heavier than a hammer. Madam, he said, your daughter has suggested that you are privy to matters relevant to this inquiry. I advise you not to obstruct me. She unfolded her gloves again, her fingers restless. There are things, she said, better left undisturbed. Wolfe's mouth tightened. Perhaps. Yet murder has disturbed them. Mrs. Harrow lifted her chin. You assume too much. Charles had his secrets. I chose not to pry. A luxury, Wolfe said coldly, that neither I nor the police can afford. She met his gaze evenly. Then search the past, Mr. Wolfe. But you may find that some ghosts do not rest quietly. It was as close to a confession as we were likely to get from her. Not a denial, not an admission, merely a warning, delivered with the resigned fatalism of a woman who had already buried too many scandals. Wolfe allowed her to leave without another word, watching her with the expression he reserved for puzzles missing too many pieces. The truth was there, thick in the air, but it was going to take more than blunt questioning to drag it into the light. As the door closed behind the last Harrow, Wolfe leaned back in his chair, hands steepled against his chest. Archie, he said without opening his eyes, we are wasting time with the present. The past holds the key. Digging into 20-year-old skeletons isn't exactly my idea of fun, I said, grabbing my hat, but I've got a shovel. Metaphorically, Mr. Goodwin, preferably. I grinned, feeling the old spark of the hunt stir in my chest. There were truths buried in the Harrow family's history, truths someone was willing to kill to protect, and it was time to start digging. Digging through city records isn't glamorous work. It's the kind of assignment that makes a man long for trench warfare or a slow afternoon tailing a pickpocket through Macy's. But when Wolfe pointed his thumb at me that morning and said simply, Caroline Vance, I knew my destiny was etched in the fine dust of public archives. It took the better part of the day, but persistence is a professional virtue. I found her listed under an address in Brooklyn that had seen better decades, and possibly better centuries. The building was an ancient hulk of red brick and sagging window frames, as if the whole structure were waiting for someone to declare it legally dead. I rang the bell twice before a cautious voice filtered through the crack. Who is it? Archie Goodwin, I said. I'm not selling anything except the truth. After a long pause, the door opened just enough to reveal a woman in her early 60s. Caroline Vance had the look of someone who had lived too many winters on too little warmth. Grey hair pinned back in tight coils, sharp brown eyes watching me like I might be the harbinger of her last bad day. I need to ask you some questions, I said. About Charles Harrow. She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing me inside. Sometimes, when you're hunting ghosts, they're willing to open the door. You just have to look like you're already haunted. Caroline Vance's living room was neat in the way small spaces often are, orderly out of necessity, not pride. A faded sofa, a wobbly lamp, a small table littered with papers and bills no bigger than the hopes that once furnished them. She sat with a sigh that seemed to drain years from her, folding her hands in her lap. "You said Charles Harrow?" she murmured. "I haven't heard that name aloud in— Lord, it must be 20 years. "I imagine it's not a name that brings back fond memories," I said, keeping my tone easy. "No," she said simply. I waited, giving her the silence people feel the need to fill. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked for him as a housekeeper. He was kind at first, then affectionate." Her cheeks coloured, a fragile rose blooming against weathered skin. "I got pregnant," she said bluntly. "He made promises, none of them kept." "And the child?" I asked, though the answer was already tightening my gut. Tears welled in her eyes, and she pulled a crumpled handkerchief from her sleeve. "A boy. He was sickly, died before his first birthday." There was no artifice in her grief. It was old but raw, the kind that still lived under the skin. I sat back, pretending to study a spot on the wall while giving her dignity. "I'm sorry," I said. It wasn't much, but it was honest. She nodded, pressing the handkerchief to her mouth to stifle a sob. "There's nothing left to tell, Mr. Goodwin. He's gone. He's been gone a long time. Except the dead have a way of refusing to stay buried, especially when inheritances start calling their names from the grave." Caroline's story would have played well on any stage that demanded tears and regret, but there were cracks in the scenery if you knew where to look. After offering her a muttered thanks and seeing myself out, I leaned against the splintered railing on the porch and turned her timeline over in my head. A boy, dead before a year old. A scandal hushed by wealth and silence. A grieving mother tucked away in Brooklyn like a dusty book no one wanted to read again. All very tidy. Too tidy. Back at the brownstone, I dug into the public birth and death records. It wasn't easy. 19 years was enough time for records to go missing or for names to get twisted into near myth, but a few fragments surfaced, enough to trouble the waters. There had been a child born to a Caroline Vance in the expected year, all right. A boy, listed as living at time of discharge, but no corresponding death certificate followed in the months thereafter. I made a few quiet calls to some old friends who owed me favours, and didn't ask why I needed to know about a boy who was supposed to have died before his first birthday. One called me back with a single, tantalizing line. "You sure he's dead?" No hospital reported an infant death matching that description. It wasn't proof yet, but it was enough to suggest that somewhere out there a young man existed who had no idea he was sitting on a fortune, or that someone might kill to make sure he never found out. By the time I returned to the brownstone, night had wrapped the city in a dirty velvet cloak, and Fritz's dinner offerings were perfunctory at best, a stew that could have doubled as masonry paste. Wolfe was already entrenched in his chair, sipping his second beer, the outlines of contentment forming around his massive frame. I delivered my report in full, sparing none of the messy details. When I finished, Wolfe lifted his heavy lids halfway, considering. "You believe she lied," he said, not asking. "I believe she concealed," I said. "Which is worse? A liar can be cornered. A woman protecting someone she loves, that's a whole different beast." Wolfe grunted, a sound that could have meant agreement or mere digestion. "It is axiomatic," he said, "that the simplest explanation is often wrong. The notion that Caroline Vance lost her child fits too neatly. People of modest means rarely discard assets, and a child—" He paused, his lips curling into something close to disdain. "Is an asset, however sentiment may attempt to varnish it." "Then you think he's alive?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that a living fourth heir explains both the anomaly in the will and the urgency of Grant Harrow's death." I nodded, feeling the pieces realign inside my head. It wasn't about shame, it wasn't about old wounds or ancient betrayals. It was about possession, of money, of status, of legacy, and it was about fear. Someone had feared Grant Harrow enough to kill him before he could expose the truth. "You'll want me to find him?" I said. "Of course," Wolfe said mildly. You are uniquely suited to chasing phantoms through the clutter of human vanity." He closed his eyes again, as if the matter were now simply one of logistics. But even as I headed out, coat buttoned against the chill, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple game of hide and seek. It was a game of survival, and somewhere out there, a man who didn't even know he was a harrow was about to learn just how dangerous a hidden inheritance could be. Wolfe had a rule about finances. He hated discussing them unless he was receiving them. Nevertheless, when murder knocked, even Nero Wolfe acknowledged that following the money was a shortcut to truth. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, tapping a finger against the arm of his chair, "it is axiomatic that wealth and its deficiencies are fertile grounds for crime. I want their financial skeletons exhumed." He didn't need to say whose. Victor and Claudia Harrow, two chips off the old Harrow block, each polished with entitlement but hiding their cracks under a thin lacquer of decorum. I spent the better part of the next day doing what I did best, easing information out of reluctant sources, a few calls, a few coffee shop meetings, a few dropped names, and suddenly people who hadn't remembered anything were suddenly filled with confessions. If the Harrow estate was a tree ripe for plucking, it turned out both Victor and Claudia had been reaching for the fruit long before their father's funeral bell had tolled. The only question was whether their need had driven them from temptation into murder. And considering what I found in the next few hours, temptation was putting it mildly. Victor Harrow's finances were a minefield, and he was tiptoeing barefoot through it. According to one discreet bank contact, whose tongue loosened nicely after a small application of cash and charm, Victor's respectable salary as an adjunct professor was a polite fiction masking a bleeding reality. The real story was in his gambling. Private poker clubs, high-stakes backroom games, a few flirtations with bookies who didn't forgive or forget. The numbers were staggering. He owed close to $200,000, scattered across various discreetly silent creditors, some less silent than others. And creditors, in my experience, were remarkably intolerant when it came to heirs dragging their feet waiting for an inheritance. It wasn't just about owing money, it was about owing it to the wrong people, the kind who didn't send reminders through the mail, but through visits with baseball bats. Victor had motive in spades: remove Grant, split the estate faster, erase his debts before someone erased him. I jotted the facts in my notebook and circled them twice. Victor Harrow might have worn tweed jackets and spectacles, but under the corduroy veneer beat the heart of a man watching the clock run out, and desperate men make dangerous choices. But desperation was a crowded room in the Harrow family. Claudia, I was willing to bet, had her own membership card, and it didn't take me long to find the proof. Tracking Claudia's trail was a trickier endeavor. She was smarter than Victor, shrewder in hiding her mistakes, more charming when she needed to grease the wheels of deception. But charm had its expiration date, and New York's art world, while glamorous, was as gossipy as a knitting circle. Through a contact at a mid-tier gallery who owed me for preventing a small embezzlement scandal a few years back, I learned Claudia's dirty little secret. She'd been selling off art under the table, not her own, of course. Claudia wouldn't dirty her hands with creation when she could profit from curation. Family pieces borrowed on long-term loan from the Harrow collection had quietly disappeared into private sales overseas. Most of the transactions had been masked through intermediaries, but a few had slipped, an unsigned portrait here, a minor impressionist there, and the money had kept her silk scarves and Parisian shoes flowing without denting her official bank accounts. It wasn't grand theft exactly, more like death by 1,000 cuts to the Harrow legacy. And it was unsustainable. Sooner or later, Grant Harrow, or whoever managed the estate, would have noticed. And Grant, from what I'd seen, wasn't the kind of man to let his inheritance bleed out while his sister flitted across Europe. Claudia had as much to fear from Grant's scrutiny as Victor had from his creditors, and fear, as Wolfe often observed, was a prime ingredient in the recipe for murder. By the time I returned to the brownstone with my pockets full of unpleasant facts, Wolfe was predictably at his desk, tapping his forefinger against his lips with the slow, inexorable rhythm of thought. I laid out my findings methodically. Victor's mountain of gambling debt, Claudia's little art collection hemorrhage. Two desperate heirs, two strong motives. Wolfe listened without comment, his gaze distant. Only when I finished did he move, shifting his considerable bulk forward an inch. "Both," he said, "had reasons to expedite the division of the estate." "Yeah," I said, dropping into the red chair. "But motives like cheap cologne in this crowd, they're all wearing it." He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Indeed. Yet opportunity and temperament narrow the field." "Victor's got the nerves of a hummingbird," I said. "Claudia's cold enough to plan a poisoning over brunch." "And both," Wolfe mused, "possess an intimate familiarity with their brother's habits, his fondness for brandy, his predictable rituals." He steepled his fingers. "Yet the method, cyanide, crudely administered, suggests haste, panic." "Victor," I said, "gambling debts breathing down his neck." "Perhaps," Wolfe allowed. "But we must not neglect Claudia's penchant for theatrical gestures, nor the possibility that both are acting on incomplete knowledge." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Wolfe said, "that the fourth heir threatens more than money. He threatens secrets." I sat back, feeling the puzzle pieces shift again. Victor and Claudia had every reason to want Grant out of the way, but whether they wanted him dead, or someone had merely capitalized on their desperation, was the question still hanging over our heads like the blade of an executioner's axe. And Wolfe, as always, intended to make sure it dropped cleanly on the right neck. It takes a special kind of fool to stage a poisoning at a faculty dinner, but then desperation makes fools of everyone. I got the call just as I was preparing to break the grim news about Victor's financial woes to Wolfe. It wasn't Victor calling. It was the dean of faculty himself, a man whose voice suggested that if I didn't get there fast, the whole evening would dissolve into a scandal suitable for the morning papers. When I arrived, Victor was sprawled across a linen-draped table, unconscious but breathing, surrounded by a ring of nervous academics who looked like they'd prefer to publish papers about the event rather than intervene. A quick word with the attending physician, a man who looked almost disappointed that Victor wasn't already a corpse, confirmed it. Poison again. Not cyanide this time, but something slower, something designed to distress rather than destroy. Wolfe would recognize the signature immediately. A message, not a murder. I checked the wineglass Victor had been sipping from. It had been cleared away already, of course. Neatness is next to cluelessness at these affairs. Victor regained consciousness a few minutes later, groggy and mumbling. I leaned in to catch his first words. "It was Claudia," he whispered hoarsely. "Claudia's trying to kill me." The drama was tiresome, but not uninteresting. Another attempted poisoning meant the stakes were still climbing, and someone, perhaps Claudia, had decided that removing obstacles was worth a second try. Or Victor had decided to stage a scene of his own. By the time I hustled Victor out of the faculty dining room and into the cooler, slightly less judgmental air of a side corridor, he was shaking more from indignation than from poison. "She's trying to kill me," he said again, voice rising. "Can't you see that? First Grant, now me." "Take it easy," I said, steering him toward a chair. "You're not dead yet." He grabbed my sleeve, wild-eyed. "You have to protect me." Which, considering I wasn't in the bodyguard business, was a charming notion, but not one Wolfe was likely to endorse without a significant increase in our retainer. Before I could answer, a furious figure appeared at the end of the hall. Claudia, of course, wearing an expression that could have turned a diamond back into coal. "You little coward," she snapped. "You staged this." Victor tried to rise, but succeeded only in looking like a marionette with a few strings missing. "Staged it," he gasped. "You tried to kill me." Claudia advanced on him like a battleship. "If I wanted you dead, Victor, you'd be dead. You think a little nausea-inducing poison proves anything? You're pathetic." I stepped between them, mostly to prevent a second crime scene. Enough, I said. You want to kill each other, fine, but not on my time. Victor collapsed back into the chair, panting. Claudia glared daggers at him, and at me for good measure, before sweeping off down the hall. If there had been any lingering sentiment between the Harrow siblings, it was now formally dissolved. Wolfe was going to enjoy sorting through this cesspool of familial affection, or, knowing him, he would despise it and solve it anyway, out of principle, and it wasn't going to get any easier, considering what was about to hit us next. Back at the brownstone, Victor's dramatics were laid before Wolfe like a particularly unpleasant hors d'oeuvre. Wolfe listened, or rather endured, Victor's breathless recounting of Claudia's supposed murderous intent with an expression of supreme indifference. When Victor finally wound down, Wolfe spoke, his voice clipped. "You exaggerate," he said. "Or you fabricate. Neither is helpful." Victor flushed. "You think I poisoned myself?" Wolfe sipped his beer. "I think you overestimate your significance. Poison is not a trifling inconvenience to be arranged for theatrical effect." I bit back a grin. Wolfe had a way of insulting a man that left him too baffled to take offense. "You're saying—" Victor began, but Wolfe waved a hand. "I am saying," Wolfe interrupted, "that you are a distraction. You muddy the waters. You force conclusions prematurely." He set his beer down with deliberate precision. "Someone staged an incident," Wolfe continued. "Whether you conspired in it or merely served as a convenient pawn remains to be seen. But it is not Claudia's clumsiness that troubles me. It is the timing." I caught the glint in his eye. "Timing?" I prompted. Wolfe nodded. "The more public the disturbance, the more private the maneuver behind it. While attention fixates on this petty drama, something more substantial is being hidden." Victor sputtered in protest, but Wolfe had already dismissed him with a glance. He was right, of course. If someone wanted us distracted, they had succeeded. And I had a sinking feeling we were about to find out what we'd missed. The clue we missed didn't wait long to announce itself. It came in the form of a phone call from one of my more reliable informants, a janitor with a taste for whiskey and a knack for noticing who entered and exited unremarkable tenements. "That woman you asked me to keep an eye on," he said, voice low. "Caroline Vance. She's gone." "Gone how?" "Cleared out. Fast. Left the apartment looking like a hurricane hit it. No forwarding address." I hung up, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. I relayed the news to Wolfe, who accepted it with the gravity of a man noting a piece removed from a chessboard. "Pfui," he said. "Predictable." "Somebody scared her off," I said. "Or worse," Wolfe said grimly. "Concealment of truth breeds urgency. Urgency breeds elimination." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Find her, Archie," he said, "before someone ensures that her silence becomes permanent." He didn't need to elaborate. Caroline Vance was more than a loose end now. She was a fuse, and the flame was getting closer. If there's a place more stubborn than city records, I haven't found it. The clerks there are paid to believe every scrap of paper they file away is the crown jewels, and any attempt to retrieve them must be treated as either larceny or lunacy. Fortunately, I'd built a few bridges there over the years, mostly out of favors and occasionally out of plain hard cash. It took 2 hours of wrangling, a strategically placed $20 bill, and a promise to forget how I got it, but eventually a man named Devlin leaned over a battered counter and muttered, "Sealed file, adoption, 1914, name was Vance, Mother Caroline." He slid the file under the glass partition without looking me in the eye. I flipped through it carefully. Caroline Vance, age 19, gave birth to a male child. The paperwork suggested a hasty, quiet adoption arranged through an attorney. No mention of Charles Harrow by name, but the timeline fit, the location fit, and the sudden generosity in Caroline's bank records fit too. What caught my eye most was the listed name of the adoptive family, Walsh. It was a common enough name, but not common enough to ignore in this context. The file indicated the boy had been placed with relatives of a lawyer already working discreetly with Harrow. A neat little circle, drawn tight and silent. I tucked the papers back together and slid them into my coat. The trail hadn't gone cold, it had merely gone respectable. Someone had buried the fourth heir in legal paperwork and polite deception, and like most buried things, it was starting to rot from underneath. Back at the brownstone, I spread out the copied documents on Wolfe's desk while he glared at them as though they personally offended his sense of order. "You are certain," he said without lifting a hand. "As certain as city records ever lets a man be," I said. "The child didn't die, he lived. He was adopted into the Walsh family." Wolfe grunted. "The Walshes? There are Walshes enough in this city to found a colony." "True," I agreed, "but there's only one Walsh who's been orbiting the Harrow estate for 20 years. Wolfe opened his eyes fully. "Lyman Walsh." Bingo. The realization settled in the room like an unwelcome draft. Lyman Walsh, the trusted family attorney. The man who had overseen the estate's legal affairs. The man who had been in the room when Charles Harrow's will had been prepared, and the man conveniently positioned to inherit if no official fourth heir materialized. It was elegant, if you liked your treachery wrapped in fine stationery. "He's been within arm's reach the entire time," I said. "No need for fake documents or sudden claimants, just patience." Wolfe's mouth curled slightly, a grim parody of a smile. "He arranged to inherit without contest," Wolfe said, "without exposure. Until Grant perhaps began to suspect. And then Grant ended up dead." Wolfe nodded once, a gesture heavy with inevitability. The fourth child hadn't been lost or hidden. He had simply learned that the best place to hide was in plain sight, close enough to steer events, distant enough to appear innocent. And he had been steering them with a steady hand for years. Until now. By the time Wolfe summoned Lyman Walsh to the brownstone under the pretext of a clarification regarding the estate, the stage was fully set. Walsh arrived precisely on time, as orderly and colourless as ever. Neat charcoal grey suit, polished shoes, a leather briefcase that looked capable of containing either contracts or confessions. Wolfe didn't offer him a seat. He merely gestured toward the rug in front of his desk. "You are familiar, Mr. Walsh," Wolfe said, "with the penalties for fraud upon a court." Walsh's mouth tightened slightly. "I have no idea what you're insinuating, Mr. Wolfe." "No?" Wolfe asked, almost pleasantly. "Then permit me." He spoke slowly, laying out the facts like a prosecutor, building his noose. The sealed adoption, the Walsh connection, the unrecorded death, the carefully managed proximity to Charles Harrow's affairs. Walsh's hands clenched on the handle of his briefcase. "You have no proof," he said sharply. "Proof sufficient for a prosecutor? Possibly not. Proof sufficient for an inquisitive Inspector Kramer? Indubitably," Wolfe said. He let the silence stretch. "You murdered Grant Harrow," Wolfe said. Walsh's face turned a peculiar shade of grey. "He knew," Wolfe continued mercilessly, "or suspected, enough to threaten your silent inheritance." For a moment I thought Walsh might break down right there, but he straightened, adjusted his cuffs, and said nothing. It was as good as a confession to Wolfe's mind, and to mine. And it confirmed what we already knew. Blood will out, no matter how carefully you attempt to disguise it. When Walsh had been escorted out, quietly, politely, with Inspector Kramer summoned by a discreet call, Wolfe leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. It wasn't satisfaction he radiated. It was a somber, heavy contemplation. "Justice," he said, "is a clumsy thing, Mr. Goodwin. It often requires artifice to operate with any semblance of grace." "You think Kramer will get a confession?" I asked. Wolfe opened one eye. "Given sufficient discomfort, yes. Mr. Walsh will conclude that continued silence is more injurious than cooperation." "And the Harrow family?" Wolfe exhaled a slow, deliberate sound. "Ravaged, irrevocably." I didn't argue. You couldn't patch up a house once the rot had been exposed. "The will?" I asked. Wolfe shrugged. "The estate will fracture along the lines Charles Harrow intended to conceal." A fitting irony. I watched him for a moment, the way he sipped his beer as if washing the taste of betrayal from his mouth. "You know," I said, "sometimes I think you hate being right." He smiled slightly without humor. "It is a singularly unrewarding consolation." Outside, the city kept grinding its endless, indifferent rhythm. Inside the brownstone, Wolfe sat like a mountain that had seen too many storms pass. And somewhere, Caroline Vance's son, no longer a phantom, no longer a secret, was finally forced to claim the blood that had always been his, even if it came at the cost of everything else he'd ever believed about himself. When Wolfe summoned the Harrows and Walsh to the orchid rooms, it wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in polite invitation. I made the calls personally, making sure there was just enough urgency in my voice to set their nerves jangling before they even crossed the threshold. The orchid rooms were Wolfe's private cathedral, and he only invited the congregation when he intended to preach damnation. Victor and Claudia arrived first, trading cold glances but standing together against whatever storm Wolfe had planned. Mrs. Harrow came next, looking more like a woman attending her own wake than a family summit. Walsh was the last, punctual to the second, his briefcase tucked under one arm like a shield. Wolfe, ensconced in the high-backed chair at the far end, regarded them as a Roman emperor might have regarded barbarians, curious, but ultimately unimpressed. "You will listen," Wolfe said, his voice smooth but iron-hard. "And you will refrain from interruptions. Questions will be permitted after my exposition is complete." They nodded, some more grudgingly than others. The heat from the orchids wrapped around us, heavy and intoxicating, but the chill in Wolfe's voice cut through it easily. He glanced at me, once, to confirm I was ready. I gave him the slightest nod. And with that, Wolfe began to peel back the final layers of deception with the slow, relentless precision of a man cutting rot from a rare and precious bloom. Wolfe's voice remained calm, even languid, as he laid the foundation. "You were all content to believe," he began, "that Charles Harrow's will was anomalous, perhaps the result of senility or sentimentality. Yet the inclusion of a fourth heir was neither whim nor error. It was deliberate, because the fourth heir exists." Victor shifted, his discomfort blooming visibly. Claudia folded her arms, her expression tight. Mrs. Harrow closed her eyes for a moment, perhaps in prayer or resignation. "Lyman Walsh," Wolfe said, turning his gaze fully on the attorney. "Is that heir?" The room went still, save for the faint mechanical hum of the orchid room's ventilation. Walsh's fingers tightened on his briefcase. "Absurd," he said, but it lacked conviction. Wolfe ignored the interruption. "Born of Caroline Vance and Charles Harrow, hidden through an arranged adoption, raised with proximity to the family he was forbidden to claim." He leaned slightly forward, a mountain poised to topple by choice, not force. Grant Harrow, having reviewed certain financial irregularities and questioned his father's last dealings, grew suspicious. He sought confirmation. Wolfe's lips thinned. "And so, Mr. Walsh, you acted." Wolfe's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You poisoned Grant Harrow, not in a fit of rage but coldly, efficiently, before he could expose you and sever your carefully nurtured claim to the estate." Walsh's face was a mask, but masks crack under sufficient heat. "Mr. Walsh," Wolfe said quietly, "you did not merely kill a man. You attempted to bury your own origins under his body." And as the silence in the orchid room deepened into something colder and heavier, Wolfe prepared to deliver the proofs that would shatter the last defenses entirely. Wolfe gestured, and I stepped forward, handing over a sheaf of neatly organized documents. "The foundation of your deception, Mr. Walsh," Wolfe said, "rests on three elements: fabricated adoption records, falsified death certificates, and the manipulation of timelines." He held up the first paper. "City records, though notoriously disorganized, hold certain immutable truths. The adoption file for Caroline Vance's child was sealed but not destroyed. The trail leads directly to the Walsh family." Wolfe laid the paper on the table, deliberate, final. Second, there is no verifiable death certificate for the infant you claim was lost, an omission masked for decades by bureaucratic indifference and by careful legal obfuscation. Walsh shifted again, a bead of sweat blooming at his temple. And third, Wolfe said, Grant Harrow's private investigator, hired shortly before his death, uncovered discrepancies in estate filings. His notes, retrieved despite your ham-fisted attempt to steal them during your break-in, document these findings. I produced the crumpled notebook, retrieved from the attempt on Wolfe's own files days earlier, and placed it beside the adoption record. The investigator knew enough to make you desperate, Wolfe said, enough for you to act. Walsh's knuckles whitened around the handle of his briefcase. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Wolfe inclined his head slightly. Would you care to refute? The question hung in the air, rhetorical and merciless. There was no refutation coming, only the slow, grinding collapse of the careful edifice Lyman Walsh had spent his life constructing, and the sharper fall yet to come. Inspector Kramer arrived on cue, stomping into the orchid room with the grim satisfaction of a man about to collect overdue accounts. "What's the charge?" Kramer barked. "Murder," Wolfe said simply, "and assorted frauds, if you wish to gild the lily." Kramer's eyes flicked to Walsh, who now looked smaller somehow, a man shorn of the layers of dignity and distance he had worn like armor. "You have evidence?" Kramer demanded. Wolfe gestured lazily to the table. "Sufficient," Kramer grunted, signaling to the two officers behind him. "Lyman Walsh, you're under arrest for the murder of Grant Harrow. You have the right to remain silent." The usual litany droned on, but I wasn't listening. I was watching Walsh. He didn't resist. He didn't protest. He merely sagged, as if the weight of his own lies had finally crushed him from within. Mrs. Harrow turned away, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Victor stared at the floor, his jaw working soundlessly. Claudia lit a cigarette with a hand that didn't tremble, but the smoke, spiraling from her lips, betrayed the turmoil she refused to show. As Walsh was led away, Wolfe remained seated, the master of a battlefield where the victors found no pleasure in their survival. "Truth, Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said after a moment, "is rarely a salve." "No," I said, pocketing the crumpled investigator's notes. "But it sure as hell clears the air." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "Fritz will bring beer," he murmured. "You will join me." It wasn't an invitation, it was a sentence. The Harrow family would splinter now, torn by revelations they had never dared confront. A fortune would be divided, but the true inheritance, the shame, the betrayal, the bloodstains, would linger longer than any money. And as for us, we had merely pruned another corrupted branch. The rot, Wolfe would have said, was eternal. The brownstone had never felt heavier, not even after we cracked open bigger scandals or stared down meaner killers. It wasn't the police or paperwork that weighed on the air. It was the kind of silence that comes when something has been broken too thoroughly to ever mend. Wolfe and I sat in the office without speaking. The orchids, carefully tended and oblivious to human folly, hummed faintly with their own life above us, but even they seemed subdued. Wolfe hadn't moved much since Kramer had taken Walsh away. His hands were still folded across his stomach, his gaze fixed on some middle distance only he could see. I didn't bother him. There are times when even Nero Wolfe requires the decency of unspoken company rather than conversation. I leafed through the notes one more time. Birth records, adoption papers, forged signatures, Grant Harrow's investigators' scrawled observations. The whole sordid tale laid out in black and white, each line cutting deeper than the last. The Harrow family had crumbled not because of poverty or violence or external enemies. They had crumbled because they had built themselves atop a lie, and when the foundation cracked, it had taken them all with it. The worst part was how inevitable it had all seemed, once Wolfe had pointed out where to look, and worse still that none of it could have been stopped. After a time, Wolfe spoke, not loudly, but with the kind of weight that settles on a man's shoulders after a judgment has been passed. Charles Harrow, he said, as if reciting from a gravestone, was a man of formidable ambition, but pitiable cowardice. I turned my chair slightly, not interrupting. He could not face the consequences of his indiscretion, Wolfe continued, and so he crafted an elaborate silence, a hidden sun, a fabricated death, a lie meticulously maintained across decades, polished like a cherished heirloom. Wolfe's mouth tightened. But silence, Mr. Goodwin, is never eternal. It corrodes. It poisons from within. I nodded, not because he needed agreement, but because he was right. If Charles Harrow had acknowledged the child, Wolfe said, even privately, he might have spared his family this ruin. A quiet bequest, a modest trust. There are countless civilized ways to atone for human weakness. He opened his eyes fully now, the pale light of the lamp catching the lines at their corners. But pride is a more implacable warden than guilt. He shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. And pride destroyed him, and his children. Outside, a car horn bleated and was swallowed by the city. Inside, the air tasted of old secrets finally exhaled. I thought of Grant, of Victor and Claudia, of Mrs. Harrow sitting in a silent house full of echoes, and I thought of Lyman Walsh, who had spent a lifetime proving he belonged, only to find that blood, when mixed with deceit, stains more deeply than ink. The Harrow name would survive in the ledgers, perhaps, but in memory it was already dust. I leaned back, balancing the chair on its rear legs the way Wolfe hated, but he didn't even scowl. Maybe he didn't notice, or maybe tonight he simply didn't have the energy for petty battles. It's funny, I said finally. They ended up with 4 kids after all. Wolfe arched an eyebrow without speaking, a signal for elaboration. 3 alive, I said, to fight over the ashes. It wasn't a joke, though it sounded like one. Wolfe didn't smile, neither did I. In the end, that was what remained. Victor, broken and desperate, bound tighter to his debts than to any sense of family honor. Claudia, sleek and brittle, clinging to what illusions she had left. And Lyman Walsh, stripped of everything, name, legacy, freedom, because he had dared to believe that blood alone could confer destiny. Family, Wolfe had once said, was an accident of biology. Honor was a choice. The Harrows had chosen poorly. I tilted my chair forward again and rested my elbows on my knees. "What do you think happens to them now?" I asked. Wolfe closed his eyes for a long moment before answering. "Nothing of significance," he said. "They will continue, diminished but not enlightened. Regret is not a fertile soil." It was harsh, but I couldn't argue. You don't bury a lie that deep without knowing it will bloom into something ugly when it finally breaks the surface. And you don't survive that harvest without losing something vital along the way. The Harrows had sown the wind. Tonight, they reaped the whirlwind. Fritz brought the beer in without needing to be asked, placing it carefully at Wolfe's elbow and retreating without a word. Even he sensed that no culinary flourish would lighten the mood tonight. Wolfe poured 2 glasses, slid one across the desk toward me and raised his own in a silent, sardonic toast. We drank without speaking. The orchids rustled faintly overhead, their perfumed heads swaying gently in the artificial breeze. After a time, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes again, his features settling into an expression I rarely saw, one that was not contentment, nor irritation, but something closer to sorrow. There would be no more visitors tonight, no more cases opened, no more puzzles to unwind, only the quiet acknowledgement that some battles once fought left no victors, only survivors. I finished my beer slowly, letting the bitter aftertaste anchor me in the moment. The brownstone around us, usually so inviolable, felt almost fragile, as if even Wolfe's fortress could be shaken by the sheer weight of human frailty revealed. Eventually Wolfe opened his eyes, heavy-lidded but clear. "Tomorrow," he said, "there will be another problem." "Naturally," I said. He allowed a ghost of a smile. And another fool thinking himself clever. And another check to pay the bills, I added. That earned a brief nod. But for tonight, there were no fools to outwit, no checks to chase, just the fading echoes of a family undone by its own secrets, and two men who had seen it happen too many times before to pretend surprise. Wolfe raised his glass again, a final salute to the inevitable collapse of human vanity. I raised mine in answer. Outside, the city pulsed on, indifferent and eternal. Inside the brownstone, silence and understanding reigned. As the final echoes of the Harrow family's collapse faded, Nero Wolfe offered one last reflection. When a man plants a lie deep enough, he does not bury shame. He cultivates ruin. The mystery may be solved, but the lesson lingers. Not every secret can be silenced, and not every inheritance is a blessing. What do you think was Lyman Walsh's greatest mistake? Trusting his bloodline or underestimating the truth? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this case, be sure to subscribe for more Nero Wolfe mysteries and share this story with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction.